Hello, everybody. My name is Robert Baines. I am the President and CEO of the NATO Association of Canada, a charitable nonprofit dedicated to informing Canadians about the value of security and the importance of NATO. When we talk about NATO, it's usually in the context of Canada's dedication to internationalism, being part of multilateral connections, and to maintaining our connections with other bilateral countries that help to maintain Canada's peace, prosperity, and security through participation in the rules-based international order. India, of course, has always been a great partner of Canada, a fellow member of the Commonwealth, and we're here today to talk with His Excellency, the High Commissioner of India to Canada, and I'll be introducing two of our discussant partners with His Excellency in just a short order. But first, I wanted to remind all of those who are watching that if you are concerned about Canada's place in the world, about global peace and security, consider maintaining a link with our community. The NATO Association of Canada continues to push for conversations that help link Canadians with the global conversations that are going on today. Canadians can't shy away from these. They have to be a part of them. So we are happy to have you as part of our conversation today. If you are interested, please consider membership. Also, you can take a look at our social media on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram. And of course, please subscribe to us on YouTube. Make sure you don't miss any of our future conversations. But now I'm pleased to pass it over to Ajay Sharma and Nicole Doherty, two of our outstanding research analysts at the NATO Association of Canada, and very important parts of our team to help make sure our mandate is fulfilled. Ajay, Nicole, please take it away.
Thank you, Mr. President. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our series of events discussing the future of North Atlantic cooperation. My name is Ajay Sharma, and I'm a research analyst and ambassador coordinator at the NATO Association of Canada. We are a not-for-profit organization aimed at educating Canadians on the value of peace and importance of NATO.
And as Robert mentioned, my name is Nicole Doherty, and I am a research analyst at the NATO Association of Canada.
We are honored to be joined by His Excellency Ajay Bisaria, the High Commissioner of India to Canada. Thank you for joining us, High Commissioner.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
His Excellency has been the High Commissioner of India to Canada since March of 2020. His Excellency is a career diplomat who has earlier served as High Commissioner of India to Pakistan and as ambassador to Poland and Lithuania. High Commissioner Bisaria has also represented India at the World Bank in Washington, D.C., and in embassies in Berlin and Moscow. He has served in various capacities in India in the Ministry of External Affairs, Department of Commerce, and the Prime Minister's Office. The High Commissioner has a bachelor's degree in economics, an MBA from IIM Kolkata, and a master's degree in public policy from Princeton University. After that wonderful introduction, High Commissioner, we invite you to begin with some opening remarks before I pass it on to my colleague Nicole to take it away with the questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Robert Baines, President of the NATO Association of Canada, our moderators today, Nicole and Advait, all participants joining us today. Warm greetings, very good afternoon. It's literally quite warm in Canada at this point, matching Indian temperatures. Let me start by thanking the NATO Association of Canada for this opportunity to present an Indian perspective on a few key issues. This is a well-timed discussion. In 5 days, this Sunday, we will celebrate the 75th anniversary of India's independence. So I thought in my opening remarks, I would briefly talk about India's journey of the last 75 years before speaking of the Indo-Pacific and talking of the India-Canada partnership. Well, India's freedom came on the 15th of August, 1947, after 200 years of colonial rule and depredation by the British Empire. The moment had come with a painful and bloody partition of the subcontinent. India's choice then of a democratic path was an act of faith by a post-colonial society. Thanks to the vision of the founding fathers, India had firmly rejected theocracy, military or communist rule, or even a partial democracy with limited franchise. The whole conversation was about having a full-fledged democracy which matched the best in the world. Within 3 years of independence, India had crafted a very forward-looking progressive constitution, a charter of democracy and equality, which was picking up the best ideas from democracies of the world, including at that point from Canada. And India's constitution was looking to create a model of a society which is similar to what Canada had, a mosaic reflecting the diversity and the pluralism of India rather than a melting pot for forging a new identity. And this was a bold experiment. At that time, it was expected to fail in all the writings that you see in the 50s and 60s and much of the analysis. But despite all these dire predictions, India's democracy has not just survived, but thrived in these 75 years. 4 decades after independence, India had a seminal moment in 1991 when it adopted sweeping economic reforms to transform the economy and lift it to a high growth path to bring inclusive development, which the people were demanding from their elected governments. This was also an inflection point for India's politics. Coalition governments and powerful state governments began to represent the aspirations of India's diverse and regions and groups. Apart from the economy and polity, the moment also reflected a change in India's foreign policy. Economic reforms reinforced India's strong belief in internationalization, internationalism, in globalization. More than 50% of the GDP of India today, for instance, comes from the external sector. So 1991 was also a moment when the world changed. The Cold War came to an end. The world moved from being bipolar to unipolar for a short while, and then eventually becoming multipolar. Today, India recognizes this multipolarity in terms of its external policy and follows in policy aimed at building sustained partnerships for its growth and development, which with a number of global partners. India's role on the global high table is as a voice for internationalism. India seeks a rules-based international order with a reformed UN at its center and with space for innovative international issue-based coalitions and groupings like the G20, the Quad, the BRICS. India is, in fact, at this moment, chairing the United Nations Security Council as a non-permanent member, as also chairing the BRICS grouping for this year, and India will host the G20 summit in 2023. So this is just a mark of the internationalism that India is committed to. If you look at the next 25 years of the journey that India will make, today India stands at the cusp of a post-pandemic recovery, hoping to be a global engine of growth with a steep double-digit recovery. Excuse me. The early signs are good, both in terms of pandemic management and the economic growth prospects. More than 500 million vaccines have been delivered in arms. India's deep structural reforms of the last couple of years across sectors are bearing fruit. They came to reforms were deep, structural, and sustained in land, labor, in agriculture, in education, the financial sector, across the board to open up opportunities for a vibrant private sector and foreign investors to be able to get handsome returns. India's ambition now remains to be a $5 trillion economy by 2021 and a $10 trillion economy by the end of the decade. The early signs are positive. The IMF growth rate predictions, even for this year, are of a near double-digit recovery. And the hope, of course, is that this gets sustained in a post-pandemic period of after 2 years of recovery. India also is driven to build back better and greener, and India will continue to be a pharmacy of the world, apart from other, in post-pandemic times, with its strengths in pharmaceuticals, in IT, in innovation. So this is a moment to reflect also on the geopolitical trajectory that India could be expected to take from the point of view of its international partners over the next 25 years till it turns 100. India's rise will certainly be peaceful. India will continue to be a positive force for good in the world. India will remain committed to democracy, to pluralism based on to rule of law, and have a strong agenda of economic cooperation with the world, and particularly with other democracies. If we look for a moment at India's trajectory in the 21st century, India set off on a high growth path after 10 years after its reforms of 1991 that came with the Big Bang. Subsequently, reforms came incrementally. And India's policy priorities have been to make its voice globally heard on issues of concern. The three major disruptions, I would argue, of this century have touched India quite significantly. The first, of course, was terrorism with 9/11. Within 10 years of that came the global financial crisis of 2008 and the pandemic that we now face. These huge shocks to global security systems, to global financial systems, and to global public health systems, they've shown us that global governance structures that we had in place were not equipped to warn us, not equipped to deal with these issues robustly and in terms of responding to crises. And I think that emphasizes again the importance of reforming the global governance structures. What it also shows is that nation states need to be nimble in devising responses to deal with these shocks, but they also need to work together. India has tried to do both, creatively dealing with the post-Cold War multipolar world and also coordinating with global partners to address these problems. We needed to be part of issue-based coalitions and groupings to deal with these crises. India has been part of the global war on terror. India has, through the G20, when the G20 became an instrument to deal with the financial shock, India was part of this group of largest economies coming together, and these included India and Canada. And of course, the world is still grappling with the challenge of the pandemic. What we need is clearly is vaccine equity, the availability of that vaccine, which is the only instrument we have, which is effective at this point of time equally in the world, and we need a more proactive WHO. So I would frame India's approach to the Indo-Pacific in this larger context of India's journey. Coming to the Indo-Pacific, in the words of our foreign minister, it is not tomorrow's forecast, but yesterday's reality. The Indo-Pacific has already arrived. India's vision for the Indo-Pacific formally calls for a free, open, and inclusive order in the Indo-Pacific based upon respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of all nations, peaceful resolution of disputes through dialogue, and adherence to international rules and laws, and particularly to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. What India's approach supports and respects the right to the freedom of navigation and overflight for all the international seas. In November of 2019, Prime Minister Modi launched the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative at the East Asia Summit, which was held in Bangkok, Thailand. As an open global initiative, the IPOI, the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, draws on the existing regional cooperation architecture and mechanisms to focus on 7 central pillars, and I think they're worth repeating. Maritime security, maritime ecology, maritime resources, capacity building and resource sharing, disaster risk reduction and management, science, technology, and academic cooperation, and trade connectivity and maritime transport. What India said that it would work together with all partners on these elements of the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative towards peace, security, and stability in the region. So this is the broad construct of the very, very targeted and positive developmental agenda that India had for the Indo-Pacific. The concept of the Indo-Pacific has now gained even more currency in present times due to both geopolitical and geostrategic reasons. Historically, the Indian and Pacific Oceans have enjoyed a deep connect, facilitating the flow of goods and people and building commerce and cultural linkages. While outlining India's vision for the Indo-Pacific at the Shangri-La Dialogue, Prime Minister Modi had indicated that the geographical reach of India's idea of the Indo-Pacific, embracing Africa and extending to the Americas, which covers both the Indian and Pacific Ocean. With greater globalization and a rebalancing of power, this vast region has experienced strong and sustained economic growth, spreading from across the Pacific Rim to Southeast Asia, South Asia, and the Gulf region, and all the way to the east coast of Africa. This economic dynamism has led to increased connectivity, regional integration, and a host of economic opportunities. Last month, in a conversation with the ASEAN business community, India's External Affairs Minister said that the approach to the Indo-Pacific represents the Indo-Pacific as a return to history, because this is not really a new concept. A seamless and integrated space was disconnected decades ago by the strategy of the day. And today, as many Indian Ocean economies trade further east, and the Pacific ones too have displaced presence south and westwards, we are quite sensibly seeing the landscape for what it really is. The Indo-Pacific reflects the reality of globalization, the emergence of multipolarity, and the benefits of rebalancing. It also means the overcoming of the Cold War and a rejection of bipolarity and dominance. Most of all, it is an expression of our collective interest in promoting global security and securing the global commons. The Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative basically, I think, validates this assertion. What the transformation of the last decade has shown that it is beginning to be overshadowed, of course, by the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. It has disrupted supply chains, it's negatively impacted manufacturing, made international trade unpredictable, and ruined many service sectors. Globalized production networks remain vulnerable and fragile, with global merchandise trade falling by 5.6% in 2020 compared to 2019. And the predicted trade and services would decline as much as 15.4% in the same duration. So this decline in services in merchandise trade was the sharpest since the economic crisis we faced a decade ago in 2009, whereas the decline in services were the sharpest we had since 1990. So these are the hits that the world has taken. And this is what we need to get over by our cooperation, including in the Indo-Pacific, our responses in terms of health, in terms of digital economies, needs to be to build back greener and better. Before I conclude, just a short sort of state of play of the India-Canada relationship. Canada, of course, is a very important Pacific country as well. If I have made my first trip to Vancouver a couple of weeks ago, and we realize how Pacific Canada is in personality once you visit Western Canada. But Canada for India is a very strong partner as a sister democracy, as an Indo-Pacific democracy. and we declared a strategic partnership in 2015. The headline of that strategic partnership has been the rapidly increasing economic collaboration. And within that, there has been a huge increase in, for instance, in portfolio investment from Canada to India, going up from $5 billion to about more than $60 billion today. If we look at the big picture, India and Canada as the two largest democracies, one by population, the other by area, are natural partners. Given their common values, the converging interests, the strong leadership contacts, and the deep economic engagement. And all this, of course, is energized by people-to-people connections based on a diaspora of 1.6 million people. Also, we have huge synergies. Today, India is one of the largest suppliers to Canada of high-quality human capital, with the number of immigrants, workers, tourists, students on every metric. India is number one. And of course, India is also providing the creative genius of its companies in terms of, if you just take the example of pharma and IT companies, more than 100 of them in Canada and increasing in size by the day. And Canada remains an important supplier of financial capital, but not just financial capital, also state-of-the-art technologies. So we feel this economic relationship should be driving the political relationship, particularly because Canada is punching well above its weight in terms of both technology and finances. And even in a geopolitical sense, India no longer sees Canada as only an adjunct, a northern adjunct to the US, but a country in its G20 economy in its own right, just as Canada does not hyphenate India with any other Asian country as it's develops its policy. So I think we have a great deal in common already, and a huge degree of convergence in terms of our interests, also in the Indo-Pacific, where we feel Canada can play a stronger role, for instance, for terrorism, in fighting terrorism, for multilateralism, and also in terms of the agenda for reforms of the global architecture of governance. So I think I would perhaps stop at this stage, having given you just a quick snapshot of how India sees the Indo-Pacific, how India's journey has been, and how India sees Canada as a very valuable partner in this journey. Thank you.
Thank you, High Commissioner, for your wonderful opening remarks. We will now begin the moderated portion of the discussion before we open the floor to questions from the live audience. India and Canada have enjoyed a strong relationship forged by shared traditions of democracy and strong interpersonal connections. You mentioned this briefly in your opening remarks, but maybe we can expand on it a little more. How would you define the bilateral relationship between these two countries, and where do you think it should go in the near future?
Absolutely. As I said, this is a strong partnership between two G20 economies, one of more than 2 trillion, the other close to $3 trillion. And both these G20 economies are driven by a strong growth impulse. Canada has been part of India's journey in multiple ways. Canadian companies have already been part of India's investing in India for the last decade or so. So I think this is a strategic partnership which will be driven by the economic part of the relationship. Already we see an economic engagement of over $100 billion, which we feel by 2025 has the potential of doubling. The Canadian portfolio investment, which is of the order of $60 billion, could be about $100 billion on its own by 2025. So this is a huge vote of confidence by Canadian majors and Canadian investors in the growth prospects of India's economy, where we get handsome returns India's whole objective also is to create conditions not just for ease of living for its people, but also for ease of doing business for investors, both domestic and global. And I would say that one special factor that comes into this relationship is the 1.6 million Indian diaspora. These are people in leadership positions across sectors in politics, in economics, in science, in education, and in culture. So a lot of the energy that Canada has been driven by this diaspora, which has a disproportionate impact on Canadian society. We have 22 members of parliament. We have 3 cabinet ministers, all belonging to this diaspora. And I think this will be a special driver driving this relationship to the next level. And we've seen, for instance, one index of a strategic partnership is how you react to a crisis. Both India and Canada have cooperated during this pandemic in multiple ways. Right in the beginning, India, as the pharmacy of the world, was providing pharmauticals to Canada that were required. Later, when Canada required vaccines, India, as the vaccine maker of the world, had begun to supply vaccines. Now, of course, India is completely committed to rolling out the largest vaccine program in the world. 500 plus million vaccine doses have already been administered, and we hope to administer vaccines to about 900 million people by the end of the year. So I think the relationship is headed in a very positive direction, and we continue to look at more innovative ways of increasing these sectors of cooperation.
Indeed, High Commissioner, a relationship based on sort of these strong economic ties and, like you said, the cultural diaspora certainly bodes well for the future of these two countries. I mean, speaking of these relations, our countries enjoy a significant economic partnership with over 8.6 billion just in trade alone, in addition to the 100 billion in engagements that you just mentioned. So a secure and efficient flow of goods is vital to our shared prosperity. And you also talked about the pandemic. So sort of just touching on all those points, what would you say is the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on our trade relations specifically? And what do you think can be done in the future to better manage such economic shocks?
Well, as I said, merchandise trade and services globally have taken a hit because of the pandemic. But India is now committed to becoming not just an important engine for recovery, but also an important trading nation, increasing the levels of trade with its partners. And I'm happy to tell you that in the first quarter of this year, we have seen a resurgence in the exports. We've seen that trade has not dramatically fallen between India and Canada after reaching its record levels of $10 billion Canadian dollars last year in 2019. We are seeing trade as perhaps in 2021 recovering to that level and perhaps growing even further. So I think overall the numbers are promising, but to the larger question of how to recover from pandemic shocks, I think that is the key, to be nimble in recovery and to realize that we need global solutions to these global shocks. You know, nation states on their own can do only so much. And one of the impacts of this, the pandemic, has been that supply chains are being questioned. So there has been a lot of redefining of supply chains and reshoring of supply chains. It's completely understandable that some critical supply chains should be reshored, but the point remains that we shouldn't also fall victim to the temptation of protectionism. So we need to have robust global dialogues about trade and we need to be rapidly rising to previous levels of trade. And for that, mobility is also important, mobility of both goods and of people.
Thank you, High Commissioner. That's a great response. I think it really speaks to a lot of the things that Canadians have been seeing about COVID and its effects on not only how we see critical infrastructure and things like vaccines, but how we have to work together in the future. So much like COVID-19, climate change is another non-traditional threat that has taken the world by storm. And you mentioned it in your opening remarks, the idea of having to build back a greener and better. What would you say are the best ways that for Canada and India to work together to address the rising security concerns?
I think it's an important issue, and both Canada and India are committed to climate action. Both India and Canada played a stellar role in the Paris Agreement and the Paris Climate Summit in terms of getting together the consensus and the international agreement. 6 years down the line now, India has exceeded its commitments, one of the only major countries to have done so, the Paris commitments. India's emissions today are 60% below the global average, and the emission intensity has come down 24%. But what both countries are showing is a great deal of commitment to innovative solutions to deal with the climate crisis. We've seen these in Canada. One of the conversations we are having is on climate resilient, disaster resilient infrastructure. India had promoted a coalition of countries, it's called CDRI, a coalition on disaster relief resilient infrastructure. And this is aimed at essentially at helping less developed countries enhance their capacity to build climate and disaster resilient economies and infrastructure. And we are delighted that just this month, Canada has joined this Indian initiative of the CDRI, and we are together in this on this innovative platform. But also, I think in both countries, we see a strong domestic consensus on the need to first acknowledge and then to fight climate change, and for very strong climate action. And more than once, the prime ministers of India and Canada have had these conversations over the last couple of years in the context of the pandemic as well, on the need to build back greener. And I think that is an important conversation we continue to have at multiple levels. On renewable energy alone, for instance, India needs the technologies and can use some of the technologies that Canada has developed. India has a very ambitious target of 175 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2022 and 450 gigawatts by 2030. So it's a very ambitious agenda, and the future of India's growth and Canada's growth, I think, has to be green. And we need to keep looking at more innovative areas of harnessing technology, and particularly clean technology, that Canada has been in the forefront of developing.
Certainly, High Commissioner, climate change is going on to become not only a regional issue, but a global issue where everyone must indeed work together in the ways that you just highlighted. And speaking of regional issues, how would you describe the current sort of state of relations between India and the NATO alliance and its members in the broad sense, as they have shared interests in regional security, for example, in Afghanistan? And what does the future hold for this relationship?
Well, I think we continue to have conversations with the NATO. I can mention that the NATO Secretary General, Mr. Stoltenberg, had addressed virtually the Raisina dialogue, which is a very important dialoguing platform in India, in April 2021. That was a dialogue platform promoted by the Ministry of External Affairs India, along with one of our largest think tanks, which is the Observer Research Foundation. And he spoke of the enormous potential that we have NATO to work with India. We certainly would be open and happy to have these dialogues. And when we engage in the future, we will take on board all the suggestions that are there in order to, realize a mutual objective of a peaceful and stable world.
Thank you, High Commissioner. That's a great answer. And as the world gets more complicated and as situations in the Middle East and in the Indo-Pacific become more complicated, it's always great to see alliances building and getting stronger. So on that sort of vein, Canada has been a key player in the Indo-Pacific in recent years. And recently, NATO has indicated that the rest of the alliance will also take up a larger role in the region. Could you speak to what this means for India and the role the alliance will have in ensuring peace and security?
Well, India is in multiple conversations right now on the Indo-Pacific with multiple partners. This is, for a lot of countries, this is an evolving doctrine. As I said, the Indo-Pacific was an existing concept. It is taking on multiple dimensions in the conversations we have because of the evolving nature of geopolitics and the global climate. One of the interesting groupings that we've had in the Indo-Pacific, for instance, has been the Quad. Now, this is a grouping of democracies of the Indo-Pacific which have got together to address a set of common issues which they see. It's a very positive agenda. It focused, for instance, on vaccines. When the leaders met in a summit earlier in the year, there were conversations about vaccines, about climate change, and about technology. So I think we will find multiple ways to evolve different coalitions and different groups with different, let's say, issue-based alliances on these issues. But each country needs to be nimble about it, to look at its interests, and both individually as a nation state and collectively as a group of countries, and to work out what is in their best interests. So I think the short answer is that yes, we continue to be in conversation with a number of partners on the Indo-Pacific concept.
That is, again, a very good point. As India is so ideally placed, it has to be very careful in the conversations it has and how it has them simultaneously to ensure peace and prosperity in the region. And sort of speaking about building that sort of legitimate support for issues, whether it's in the Indo-Pacific or just globally, going forward, how do you think India and Canada can work together, to advance the rules-based international order around the world, sort of grow that legitimate support for issues that seem a world away? Absolutely. I think one of the starting points to do that is to have these conversations in the United Nations. Today, India chairs has the presidency, the rotating presidency of the Security Council in this particular month. But the larger point there is that the UN will continue to have a primacy. Both India and Canada are strongly committed to multilateralism, and we need to be discussing together what kind of global governance structure we need to see. For India already, it is important that the United Nations Security Council is reformed. We believe that answering the challenges of the future requires global governance structures to be reformulated, to be reformed. And I think Canada and India have excellent conversations in that area as well. So as two G20 economies and two strong Indo-Pacific democracies, we have a great deal of convergence of not just values, but also interests in terms of the way we approach multilateralism and the way we approach the world. So I think the future
should have India and Canada engaging in more conversations, and we'd see Canada even more engaged in the Indo-Pacific.
At response, we will bring our moderated discussion to a close, and we will be opening the floor to questions from our live audience. Edwin?
Thank you, Nicole. And I'd just like to take this opportunity to encourage our live viewers to post your questions in the chat, and we'll try and get them. We'll try and get as many to the High Commissioner as possible. With that, High Commissioner, you recently mentioned of the three shocks that India has faced as a part of its foreign policy, terrorism has been one of them. And in that regard, the United States and India especially both share concerns about the security of Pakistan's nuclear weapons, which have been targeted in the past by jihadist extremists with links to the ISI. What is India's strategy to ensure Pakistan's nuclear security and prevent nuclear terrorism? Will India reconsider its no first use policy in light of this threat?
Well, all I would say at this point is that nuclear security is an important issue for India. We continue to have global conversations on nuclear security. We also have several mechanisms in place for bilateral discussions with Pakistan on this issue. As you know, I was the High Commissioner of India in Pakistan for a couple of years just before I came to Canada. So there are mechanisms in place there. But overall, I would say that India, as a responsible nuclear power with nuclear capacity, we feel that it is important to have these conversations, particularly along nuclear safety and security. And we continue to engage in those with all partners. So I think these are certainly important issues that we keep addressing.
Thank you, High Commissioner. So the next question is about the UN framework. So India, as part of the G4, is seeking a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. If this occurs, how might it impact the structure of the Security Council and relations with other countries like Canada, who have had temporary seats in the past?
Well, at this point of time, the United Nations Security Council structure is of a Security Council with 5 permanent members with a veto and 10 non-permanent ones. So in the G4 context, we continue to have discussions on reforming this structure, which we feel answers the needs of 1945 and not 2021. We need to update our governance structures to answer the needs of present times. And we certainly feel that this process of discussion is slow, it's painfully slow. It's not as there was no reason for it to be so slow. So if countries together express that political will and reach a consensus on having a reformed structure which answers the needs of the time, I think that would remain India's position. And I'm sure in our conversations with Canada, that is also a recognition on Canada's part that global governance structures need to be reformed.
Indeed, High Commissioner, India certainly has had quite the experience with sort of, reforming government structure over its history to meet sort of, current needs. And so speaking about sort of current needs and what is going on right now, China's Belt and Road Initiative, that's what the next question is about. It appears to have sort of encircled India. Indian scholars have often talked about the string of pearls theory, with the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor and the Hambantota seaport in Sri Lanka. What is India's strategy to counteract this or sort of react to these economic initiatives in its immediate vicinity?
Well, India has a complex relationship with China. And as you know, it is at a sensitive stage right now with issues that we faced in our northern border. on issues that we see are of Chinese expansionism and of changing the status quo. But India, in a big picture, has a long experience of dealing with China. We've been two civilizations neighboring each other for 2 millennia. So we understand each other. We also, I think, have been, nation states for the last 7 decades, and we've been dealing with each other. So on the specific issue of connectivity issues, we welcome all connectivity initiatives, except that when they threaten sovereignty and territorial integrity. And that is the time when we question these initiatives. What we would not comment on is how the rest of the world would look at these initiatives, whether countries like Sri Lanka look at it as debt diplomacy or whether they look at it as something more benign is for them to decide. So I think overall we continue to have our conversations with China on a whole range of issues, and our relationship has elements both of competition and cooperation, and we continue to engage with it. India is a strong and self-confident country, so we are not particularly bothered by some of the more extreme rhetoric that we hear.
Thank you, High Commissioner. That was a great response. On a different note, the 2020 Olympics have just concluded, and India has the largest medal haul of all time. Can you speak to the importance of sports and culture in international relations stemming from the Olympic Games?
Absolutely. I think one thing the Olympics have demonstrated in these pandemic times, both in India and Canada, is that people need to celebrate sport. They need to celebrate heroes. They need to celebrate achievements and success. And I think the discourse in India after this medal haul and some heroic performances, despite odds by our athletes, is that we need to nurture sport, nurture it better. There is discourse about how we create an ecosystem for developing sporting ability, not just a government-supported one, but a public-private sort of ecosystem. But what it certainly does underline that Olympic success is something that is long-term, that doesn't come easy, that requires some degree of planning. And particularly for India, which is a very young country, with 65% plus under age of 35, I think it also represents at a level, a certain level, aspiration. And this is something to be nurtured. I think in India, we will double down on promoting sports in multiple ways. And this is, of course, in terms of a foreign policy practitioners, from a foreign policy practitioner's point of view, sports is a welcome way of connecting to the world, and of diplomacy through sports has been something which really does bring a lot of benefits to all partners.
Indeed, High Commissioner, as you mentioned earlier, India is one of the largest sort of exporters of human capital in various sectors, and has a vast sort of concoction of talent, whether it be in sport or tech. And speaking of such positive developments, as a relatively very peaceful nation, India has recently built up its military, chiefly in the naval sense, including a new carrier and nuclear ballistic submarines. What do you think is a timeline for India to gain sort of global power projection capabilities beyond the Indo-Pacific, beyond its immediate vicinity, whether it be to counter Chinese threats into international domains, or whether it just be from the sole point of just having the ability to project power?
Well, I would only respond to that at a more strategic level, to the point I referred to earlier, that India's rise will be a benign one. India does not want to threaten any other country in the world. India's defense capability is precisely that, a defensive capability. It's not meant for power projection. So I think India would continue to modernize and its defense forces. It would continue to be have a smart defense capability. But within the overall strategic sort of purpose of becoming a country which develops its economy in a way that it pulls out every last Indian from under the poverty line and brings prosperity to the rest of them.
Thank you again for such a great answer. Very insightful. On a slightly different note, one of the audience questions is, what is the difference between Asia-Pacific and Indo-Pacific, and how do you use these terms in response to India's foreign policy?
Well, this is a debate for you academic pundits, and you have to figure out what exactly is the distinction. For us, the Indo-Pacific is a recognition of the reality. So in a purely geographical sense, it is about the two oceans, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And in a broader sense, it is about a way of being a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific, being a doctrine of inclusion. So I think the distinction, the finer point is made by academics, and there are multiple interpretations of it. But I would only say that the Indo-Pacific is a reality of centuries, which has simply been sort of terminologically acknowledged in recent times.
Indeed, so we will deliberate on our and then get back to that. I'm kidding, but I was going to say that we have yet another question, sort of on the climate change. People do seem to be coming back to it. In the recent sort of IPCC climate change report, it declared a code red for humanity, which has recently come out. And of course, you've talked extensively on the topic, but could you perhaps elaborate on concrete actions that economies like India and Canada can take to minimize the effects of climate change and sort of, adopt the policy directives that have been outlined in this sort of very severe report?
Absolutely. I think this is a disturbing report for the entire planet. It is something that needs to be seen in conjunction with the more rapid and more intense extreme climate events that we are seeing even this summer, but in recent times. And I think the reality of climate change is there. It is not something that is waiting to happen in 2100, but it is something that is an immediate threat to the planet and a common threat. And I think both India and Canada have acknowledged certainly that a huge threat exists and try to change behavior. And I can speak for India that already the emissions are much lower than the global average, but also the idea is to be a proactive participant globally in finding the solutions where climate action becomes something which is part of the global public commons, and also becomes something that gets internalized in national objectives as well as in global conversations. So as I mentioned, India is having that conversation in every forum, whether it's the G20 or the Quad, bilaterally with the United States, bilaterally with Canada. I think it's important enough an issue for us to be discussing it in every fora. And one of the answers I think the future will have for us, it will be technology. Whether we can develop fast enough the technologies which will give us the ballast to be able to beat climate change at a much faster rate than it happens. And I can mention what India's objective is, for instance, in electric mobility, in e-mobility, and renewable power, renewable energy. For instance, these are two areas where we have very important goals to achieve. And the development of technology through collaborations, through groups of countries or bilaterally will be an important factor. And particularly from Canada, where clean tech and mobility solutions is something which is being researched at the cutting edge.
Indeed, and it is very important that we continue to research and continue to invest in these areas. I think we have time for one more question before we have to let you go. So a person from the audience has asked us, what are some of your career's proudest achievements? And what is some of the advice you would share with a younger member of the audience?
Well, thank you very much. I think that's a great question. I don't know if I can claim too many achievements, because much of what we do in the business of diplomacy is that it's a team sport. So a lot of what I would appear to achieve is something that we achieve together with a number of teams. Well, some of my proudest moments, or let's say happiest moments, were when I worked with the Indian Prime Minister for 5 years, Mr. Vajpayee, and a number of initiatives were taken at his time, and I was happy to be part of that team. And also in Pakistan, I think diplomacy becomes crucially important when you're dealing with a tough and hostile and often completely unpredictable relationship. So that is both exciting and challenging. And that's where diplomacy counts more than it would in a relationship that is, for instance, in very good health. So I think that those were very interesting times for me. And on the other issue of what advice I would have for younger folks, do consider a career in global affairs and in diplomacy, because that is the future. Certainly global affairs, because the world is getting to be much smaller and more interrelated. The challenges will be much more complex. So that is an interesting kind of field to be looking into, because the challenges will multiply and the need for creative solutions there will increase. And in a personal sense, I would say take those risks, whether it is in business, in entrepreneurship, as a startup, or as a policymaker. If it is for the greater good, please take the risk.
That's a wonderful note to wrap up our conversation on, High Commissioner. It looks like that's all that we have time for. We would like to convey our sincerest thanks to you for agreeing to have this conversation, and our sincerest thanks to the Indian High Commission in Ottawa, for your team for putting this all together, and of course for your thoughtful and insightful remarks. With that, I will now pass it on to my colleague Nicole for some closing remarks.
Yes, thank you, Ajay. High Commissioner, thank you again for joining us for this important and important discussion. And thank you to the audience for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed yourself. If you enjoyed today's discussion, please look for us on social media. We do host these discussions regularly, and we look forward to keeping you in the loop about what's going on internationally and bringing you wonderful discussant partners such as the High Commissioner. High Commissioner, thank you again.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.